You have just worked a 40-hour work week, a 50-hour work week, a 60-hour work week. You're really excited to get your paycheck, but upon receiving your paycheck, you realize that the government has taxed 100% of your income. Surely this is wrong. Surely this is unjust. Surely this is some kind of slavery. But if this is some kind of slavery and in principle unjust, how come we should accept in principle 40 or 50 or 30% taxation? This is what Nozick asks us to consider in the beginning of his argument for libertarianism as a principle of justice. Hi, and welcome to Inquiry with Mirage. This is my second video on libertarianism. In my previous video on libertarianism, I evaluated it as a normative theory of what constitutes wrong and right actions. I concluded that as a theory of such, it does not really make much sense. Here in this video, I will evaluate libertarianism as a doctrine of justice, as a theory of justice, specifically as a redistributive theory of justice, which can be contrasted with a penal theory of justice. As we will see, as a theory of such, libertarianism stands on much firmer ground. Before moving on to evaluating Nozick's argument for libertarianism as a theory of justice, it's worth saying something about the relationship between morality and justice in general. Some think that morality and justice are the same thing. I, however, think this is a strange way of viewing the concept, if but for nothing else, that when asking the question of whether or not something is morally good, that just seems to be a different question than when asking whether or not something is just. This is not to say that morality and justice are completely separable. Like, surely we want our theory of justice to be moral. But it is to say that morality does not dictate justice. It rather confines it and demarcates it. But I can talk more about the differences between morality and justice and why I think one ought to view them as being separate enterprises in another video. Let's now go on to evaluating Nozick's argument for libertarianism as a theory of justice. Nozick, along with other libertarians, argue that any scheme of redistribution is inherently unjust as it violates the liberties of the individual. The argument for libertarianism as a theory of justice goes something like this. Premise 1. Every individual, and only that individual, has a right to their own body. Premise 2. An individual's property is an extension of that individual's body. Premise 3. Any scheme of redistribution violates the individual's right to their own body, as it necessarily involves the transfer of property against their consent. Premise 4. If something violates the individual's right to their own body, that something is unjust. Conclusion. Any scheme of redistribution is unjust. The reason Nozick's argument is deeply problematic for theories of justice is because we, as a society, take the individual's right to their own body to be paramount. But basically all other theories of justice, which are not libertarian, will involve taxation and some scheme of redistribution. So, if Nozick's argument is correct, then it seems that any other theory of justice will be necessarily unjust as they will violate the individual's right to their own body. So what are we to make of Nozick's argument? Well, it seems hard to deny the first premise, because that would imply the denial of the fact that we own our own bodies, and presumably not something we would want to accept. If we can't deny the first premise, then it also seems that we can't deny the fourth premise, since the truth of the fourth premise follows naturally from the truth of the first premise. And it also seems that premise 3 will be true if premise 1 and premise 2 are true. Hence, and given the fact that premise 1 just seems like undeniably true, it seems like Nozick's argument trades on whether the second premise, i.e. whether property really is an extension of the individual's own body, and whether property rights are an extension of the individual's right to their own body, is true or not. Now, Nozick has a whole theory of how to make sense of the idea that one's property is an extension of one's body, and one's right to one's body is what grounds one's rights to one's property. Building on the Lockean idea from history that one's property is an extension of one's body, because to have property one needs to mix one's labor with the external world. Now, the theory that Nozick offers is very rigorous, and very complex and beyond the scope of this video. But to see the truth of premise 2, we need not, however, have a positive argument as to why it is the case that our property is an extension of our body and why our right to property is an extension of our right to our own body. We can simply establish a negative argument as to why it cannot be the case that our property is anything but an extension of our body and that our right to our property is anything but an extension of our right to our own body. Which is to say that we can argue that the implications of the view that we don't own our property in the same way that we own our body are so counterintuitive that it cannot be true, and hence it must be true that we own our property in the same way as we own our body. Here is one such argument that many individuals find very persuasive. If it wasn't the case that we and only we own the fruits of our labor, then it would be morally permissible and just for the state to have a 100% tax rate, which is to say 100% redistribution of our labor. But working without receiving any compensation for one's labor is analogous to slavery, and if it's morally objectionable and unjust for the state or anyone else to lay claim to 100% of our labor in principle, then it's also morally objectionable and unjust for the state or anyone else to lay claim in principle to any part of our labor. And if you aren't persuaded by the slavery analogy, then I think the following line of reasoning is a lot harder to resist. If it wasn't the case that we, and only we, owned our property, then it would be morally permissible and just for the state or anyone else to come and take our property at any time. But the result of this world would be a world where it would be morally permissible and just for anyone to at any time come and take something from someone else. Which would imply, for example, that if someone voluntarily gave you a piece of wood and from that piece of wood you made, for example, a wooden duck, then the state or anyone else would not be doing anything unjust by coming and just taking that piece of wooden duck from you. And more importantly, if the state were to come and take that from you, then you don't have anything within your repertoire of justice to resist the state from taking that, because they wouldn't be doing something unjust. So given these two lines of reasoning, even though we don't have a positive argument as to why premise 2 is true, i.e. why it's the case that our property belongs to us in the same way as our bodies belongs to us, it just seems that if we were to resist this argument, if we were to deny this argument, then we would get very counterintuitive implications that we don't want to accept. So does this mean that the Gnostics and the Libertarians are correct, and that in order to have a just society we must get rid of any taxation and all forms of redistribution? Well, not so fast. I think there are three ways in which we can argue against the conclusion. The first is to argue that the state in fact owns everything and everyone is just renting property from the state. Now I think it's intuitive to most people why this argument isn't that persuasive, so I won't expand more energy on explaining that. The second way to resist the libertarian conclusion is to argue that there is some type of principle of reciprocity that demands taxation. Something akin to the fact that since everyone benefits from the state and since everyone benefits from citizens at large, the way to pay back the benefits that they receive is via taxation. While I think this argument is more persuasive and a reasonable one to take, I actually think that the third argument and the third way of resisting the libertarian conclusion is the most persuasive and the one we ought to opt for. In the third way of resisting the libertarian conclusion, we fully accept the conclusion that taxation is unjust, but we argue that a world without taxation is comparatively more unjust. Compare two worlds. In world A, there is no scheme of redistribution, and in world B, there is a scheme of redistribution. As per Gnostic's argument, there is a way in which world A is more just than world B. But this does not mean that world A is overall more just than world B, because in world B, it's entirely possible that the poor will be in such a position where they will wither away and die, and that the main explanation for why they are poor and will subsequently wither away and die is the fact that they just happen to be unlucky to be poor, to be born poor into a world where the rich control everything and have no sympathy for the poor. Because recognize that this state of the world, i.e. world B, is perfectly compatible with Gnostic's argument in principle. But the point here is that it also seems unjust that people should suffer in this way due to things which are completely out of their control, i.e., people shouldn't suffer like to this significant extent due to things which are morally arbitrary in nature. Hence, it seems to be the case that were the state to like step in such a world in world B and employ a scheme of redistribution, they would be doing something unjust because they would in some sense be violating people's right to property. But they would be still doing something that is overall more just than if they were not to employ any scheme of redistribution. The upshot of this is that the state's job is like always to balance between more or less injustice. So it's not the case that we can have a scheme of redistribution and just claim, well, this is perfectly just. It's always going to be the case that once we have a scheme of redistribution, we are doing something unjust in some sense because we are violating individuals' right to their body in some sense. But this does not mean that we're doing something overall more just because we're balancing different considerations of justice. And it would be the case that we're doing something more just because without a scheme of redistribution, it is in principle possible for it to be the case that people are suffering unnecessarily needlessly large due to things which are morally arbitrary in nature, and people suffering due to things which are morally arbitrary in nature is also a state of the world which is very unjust and is more unjust than a state of the world in which that suffering is alleviated to some extent by violating other people's right to their property. So, and I think like this conception of justice like makes perfect sense when looking at the etymology of what the concept of justice is supposed to mean, because there's a reason why the concept of justice and the idea of justice is always seen as a balancing act between two different states. That is because in reality, we need to recognize that the world is very hard to get completely perfectly just, and that the world is always going to involve more or less injustice. And what our job, or like the state's job, is to balance more or less bad versions of injustice in the world. And hence, I think this is the type of argument one would want to employ against the libertarian conclusion that all schemes of redistribution and taxation at large are unjust. It is to accept their insight that yes, there is something unjust about schemes of redistribution and taxation, but not having those schemes of redistribution and not having that taxation would lead to a world which is more unjust, and hence we need those schemes of redistribution and we need that taxation because we want to have a world which is more just and not a world which is less just. In conclusion then, we can say that libertarianism as a doctrine of justice makes sense to a significant extent, right? And their argument ought to be like treated with respect, because it is a good argument, I think. But even though it's a good argument and it ought to be treated with respect, I think it's also fair to say that libertarianism fails to give us the full picture of justice due to the fact that they miss the way in which justice is always going to be comparative in nature. Yeah, so if you like this video, if you found the content to be like useful or interesting, feel free to like and subscribe and leave a comment if you disagree. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree because like the take here in this video is not necessarily one that is like nested within the best academic literature, but the take is like rather my own. And if you want to further interact, I will leave my like Twitter link down in the description and you can reach out to me there.